side. Then yeah, let's start. And thank you very much again for many years. And yeah, I want to talk today a little bit about the work, what I did in my postdoc in the past 3 years, together with international colleagues, but also my group in China at the Kunming Institute of Botany. And I can't move on. Why is that? So because maybe not all of you know exactly where the Hengduan Mountains are located, I'm just giving a short introduction where we are in our mind now, where we are moving, and yeah, the general settings. And so the Hengduan Mountains are adjoined to the east of the Himalaya. So here and south of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, and it stretches most of the Yunnan and Sichuan province. And it spans in length approximately 900 kilometers, and in width, depending on the definition, about 400 kilometers. And this size, the area size, is about 800,000 square kilometers. So it's quite a large region. And it's, from a biodiversity perspective, extremely interesting, and one of the oldest, or the oldest, biodiversity hotspot on the planet. And probably most of you know it, particularly from for garden plants such as many rhododendrons that you can find in many parks and gardens in worldwide. And this is just a little impression of the Kunming Botanical Garden, where our institute is also located. About February, March, April, it's full of rhododendrons in all kinds of colors. It's extremely beautiful. But also naturally occurring, as we will see later on. So,
Just a reaction.
Okay. So yeah, this is one of the typical tourist pictures. It's very difficult, like also on the first few slides where I'm showing a little bit of the landscape. Those are not my pictures. Those are unfortunately internet downloads. But this is because it's extremely difficult to take good pictures, because you can already see the extremely steep mountains. And when you're driving on the road somewhere here, you never can get a full picture of the mountain ridges. And also because they have a distinct monsoon cycle. So in the flowering seasons, it's basically rainy season and you're always in the clouds. So yeah, those kind of views I rarely had. Anyway, this is the first bend of the Yangtze River, so very popular. And so exactly these are also the two key drivers said to be the drivers of plant diversification in the area. It's the river system and it's the monsoon climate. And so what's so special about this river system? It's because originating in the Himalayan and Tibetan Plateau region, you have this parallel river system from the Nu River, the Langkang River, the Yingsha River, Yalong River, Dadu and Min River. And so they are dividing the Hengduan Mountains into different mountain ranges and ridges. So these entire settings between the deep, steep valleys and the mountain ridges is key to plant diversification. And so we just go a little bit through in pictures, starting from the east from the west to the east. So you first, sorry about that. So first we are looking at the mountain ridge over here between the Nu and the Langkang River. And this is also where one of the most famous mountains of the, from Yunnan into the Tibetan area is. So behind these mountains, basically Tibet starts. And so this is the Mailishan mountain. It's a holy mountain for the Tibetan people. And then one mountain range further between the Langkang and the Yingshan River. This is also where we will be moving later to our field site. So this is the Jade Dragon Yulong Mountain, close to the city of Lijiang, where we were based during our field work. And then the next one is the Kola and Chaluli Mountains. And this is also very famous mountain region, the Gyeenshan. And the next one is where actually the highest mountain of the highest peak of the Hengduan Mountains is located, the Gongsha-shan, with a little bit more than 7,500 meters of elevation. And then depending on how closely you define or how narrow you define the Hengduan Mountain region, it also extends a little bit, as I said already, towards the Dadu and Mindu River, but also south to the Dulong River. And here it looks a little bit more greenish, but this is an extremely wild setting. So I've never been in the south of Yunnan. I only went to the north. But I'm also told that this is very, very difficult terrain. So you get easily lost, and it's very hard to climb these mountains. But yeah, the wildlife, the plant diversity is spectacular. So as I said, our field locations are here in the city of Lijiang in the northwest of Yunnan province. And this is the Yulong Snow Mountain, or Jade Dragon Snow Mountain. There are different names for these mountains, depending on which ethnicity or people you talk to. And if we take the map picture away, this is showing also one of our highest field sites. It's about 4,000 meters in elevation. And a little bit lower, at about 3,200 meters of elevation, there's the Alpine Botanical Garden Field Station. It's actually an area that they have enclosed by a fence ranging from 2,700 meters, where the base station is, up to maybe 3,400 meters. But then at 3,200 meters, there's a little bit lake or reservoir, and there's the main biological station where they do a lot of field collections for plant diversity and conservation targets. And so when I talk about what we do there in terms of researching on bumblebee pollination in the Hengduan Mountains, this is basically my former group, the PI Wang Hong, and then my lab leader, Zhang Xin Ren, and then several postdocs or PhD students that all collected over the years, starting from about 2012 on different aspects of bumblebee pollination on this mountain specific. And then we have international colleagues that joined. Professor Paul Williams is the expert in the world on alpine and Arctic bumblebees. And Graham Pike, also known for working on bumblebee foraging economics. And Klaus Lunau works on visual systems of bees and hoverflies and how they see colors and dry floral evolution, perhaps. So why we are interested, especially in bumblebees in this area, is because of several reasons. And the first one is because they're particularly well adapted to life in harsh alpine environments. So there are many bumblebees and probably important as pollinators for alpine plants. But one of the major reasons is probably because they have their origin and center of biodiversity in the Eastern Himalaya, so in the Sichuan and Yunnan province, where probably about more than half than the world's known species of bumblebees exist. And just on our mountain, Paul Williams described 21 species earlier found on this just one single mountain that have to find their niches and co-occur within a narrow regional range. And then Himalayan and Hengduan Mountains are also diverse and flowering plants that rely on the interaction with bumblebees. So we probably have all known about pedicularis and primroses and many other plant families that strongly rely and can only be pollinated by bumblebees. And so therefore many species, even though flies are often hypothesized to be main pollinators in alpine habitats, many of these species actually require on bumblebee pollination for seed production. And bumblebees tend to dominate early and late in the season when many flies are not actually active. This is because of their extended life cycle from the queen emerging early in the spring until the last generation in the hive and the males that last into the autumn. So now I'm guiding you through the research question that we had over the years. You can see in the corner a little bit also whether this is ongoing work right now, or this is completed projects, or what we are planning in the future. And during this presentation of research question, I will throw in here and there some series of pictures so you can get an impression of the landscape or the plant diversity. And so the first question that we of course then have, which basically I initiated then, is to step a little bit back, not only looking at Hengduan Mountain, but asking a little bit general, so how important are bumblebees in these high elevation environments? So my aim is to look a little bit on diverse mountains and on in these flowering meadows, how prominent are bumblebees as flower visitors in this area. So two of these field sites occurring on Hengduan Mountain at 3,900, but also I went to the first peak at 4,200 meters. And then we drove a little bit further away to Hengduan Mountain, where I could easily access a meadow occurring at 4,600 meters. And hopefully in the future, I can add also more. So here you can see a little bit of the landscape impressions from these field sites. And this is a little bit of the plant community that's occurring there. So I'm sorry, I cannot always present a full species name to it, but this is also many times unknown to the Chinese people either, because very many species look so similar and they're really hard to identify just from morphology in the field. However, some I can, and so this is a very common geranium pollinated by flies as bees. The same. These are very specific South species in Asteraceae, which grows on little bumps of grass or mosses, not directly in the soil, so probably they need a little bit more water. And then one very nice autumn gentian, blue flowering, another Asteraceae. Of course, Saxifraga is also a very common family there, but difficult to identify because there can be maybe 20 yellow-flowered Saxifraga that basically look the same on the same mountains, and you can't tell them apart easily. This you maybe also know from here, closely related ones, Allium and the Nasalilaceae, which I also find extremely pretty. Something I never got to identify, unfortunately. It's not occurring in the floras. And then some fly-pollinated plants. And so, as I said, most of it is, we do field work in the rainy season. So many times we know we are in a spectacular area, but we can't see anything than the plants. So, but sometimes you're also pretty lucky and it opens up and then you have really spectacular views. So this is the actual peaks of Hengduan Mountain. And then over here is the mountain I showed you earlier, the Miley Mountain, the Holy Mountain, but I got only 2 times to see them actually. Anyway, so then all the flowers appear a little bit more sunny and you can also be lucky. And then there's a lot of sounds around you and the bumblebees and bees and everything starts foraging. We get to the bees later a little bit more. What I want to show here is that there are actually 2 peaks we identified when in general pollinators are active, but also in particular bumblebees are active. So we did that. We followed flower visitor activities in the course of a whole day. Of course, several repetitions of days, and found that they peak in the early or in the mid-morning, like around 11 o'clock, and then in the afternoon around at around 3 o'clock again. And this holds true for forest and meadow habitats. And we think that this is because this unusual bimodal pattern and not a main peak pattern in midday, as you find in many other regions, is because at high elevation, you are exposed to high solar radiation. So also pollinators and flower visitors need to avoid the direct heat during the midday when the sun is coming out. And so just a few impressions of flower visitors. So this is actually hovering at 4,200 meters against the wind. I was really impressed. And it took like maybe 15 minutes to actually feed successfully on the flower because it's so difficult for them to navigate in the wind. And then, of course, we have many flies. And what I find really nice if you can see the similarities, so this is a bumblebee, a common one, Bombus frisianus, and this is a fly. So I find it really interesting. So maybe bumblebees are actually really the better adapted to high elevation. So, but now to the results. So this is short graphs of composition of different groups of pollinators. So we have beetles almost not existing, of course, a lot of Diptera, as it is also hypothesized in other mountain regions around the world. Then Lepidoptera, so butterflies, honeybees, bumblebees, and other Hymenoptera, so other solitary bees, for all the three field sites. And what you can see is on high elevation meadows, there's really a lot of bumblebee activity. So we have confirmed our hypothesis that, yes, they are really important. But what astonished us a little bit is this, why there are so many honeybees at this high elevation. And first, my colleagues were really wondering, but then I showed them the specimens and the pictures, and yes, it's really honeybees. And they're known to spawn in the Hengduan Mountains or occurring over high elevation ranges. But this is maybe a new elevation record, actually. So we're gonna hopefully publish that in the future. So these honeybees can occur over a wide elevation gradient. And we are trying now maybe also to figure out whether this is actually the same height following the plant resource distribution, or whether these are hives nesting at different elevations. So then my colleague investigated previously how these pollinator communities are then structured across the elevation gradient. So are bumblebees specifically abundant in high elevations, or are they occurring across the entire range? And for this, we choose different field sites along this mountain, again, ranging from low elevation, 2,700 meters, up to 3,900 meters. So every 200, 300 meters, we have one of these flowering meadows where we follow or record plant pollinator interactions. So we always catch a pollinator when it lands on a flower and record the interactions and the networks. And this is just showing the summary of the data he got. So in the red, you can see the bees. He categorized it differently: long, short-tongued bees and bumblebees and other Hymenopteras, and then different genera of flies. And I've just put it into summaries across the different categories. And what you can see is that, yes, bumblebees are actually important and important contributor to pollination networks across the entire elevation range. So this is our summary. And then, but this was summarizing or lumping together all Hymenopterans and bumblebee species. So but we know there are more than 20 species occurring on this mountain. So we were asking, so how many can we find in commonly? So what are the dominant species? How many? And how do they find their ecological niches? How can they co-occur? How can they co-occur? And so we were investigating the temporal variation and also the spatial variation across the gradient. So maybe different species occur at different times of the year or in different elevational distributions. And so these are the data collected by another PhD from America on that mountain. This only shows 9 common species because the others are just too rare. They occur, but they are too rare to put into data and to analyze them together. And this is just some impression of the different species of bumblebees. So Bombus funuarius, which has a really distinct white stripe on its back. A high elevation species, Bombus chinensis, which is not so abundant on Yulong Mountain. It's more often I found it on Weimar Mountain because we are higher in elevation than. This is the most common one, Bombus frisianus, Bombus longipennis, and another one I couldn't identify. And Bombus rufofasciatus, also very dominant at high elevation meadows. And what you can see from these pictures is that somehow they look pretty similar, some of them. So some are distinct, as this one with the white, yellow, black, red, white pattern, but there are many of the ones that have black and yellow stripes and are really hard to distinguish. And then he even, Paul Williams even described a new species restricted to low elevation. So this is showing you the elevational distribution of the 9 most common species. And what we should put our focus on is what you can see is that there are some species that have a really narrow elevational range, so they are restricted to one specific elevational meadow, whereas other species really occur across the entire elevational range. And in specific, the most abundant Bombus piedianus and also Bombus lepidus can really be found across the entire elevation. So we can look at the temporal pattern of occurrence. So some occurring more early in the summer, others later into the autumn. So he collected the bumblebees between 1st of July until 1st of September. And as you can see here also, so they are ranked by the time period they're occurring. And so some bee species occur very narrowly in the beginning of the season, others narrowly in the middle or end of the season. But there are also some that have a really wide temporal occurrence, and especially also the most abundant again. So they also occur throughout the summer. But in conclusion, we can say that that both spatial and temporal patterns somehow can separate these different bumblebee species in their niches, and so they can stably coexist. And the general patterns are that less abundant bee species were largely confined to lower elevations, and the 2 dominant species, they could lower somehow their competition a little bit by the one occurring a little bit earlier in the season, and one peaks a little bit later in the season. But we're going to talk about these 2 more a little bit later on as well. So then another PhD student was investigating what factors then can actually determine the bumblebee interaction network. So how can they co-occur when they are confined into the same elevational range? Because what you can see that at mid-elevation, there's still many overlapping, even if they across the elevational gradient sort out a little bit, many are at mid-elevation co-occurring. And what we generally could assume is that phylogenetic relationship can contribute, but also functional traits and other external factors can contribute to defining ecological niches and co-occurrences of species. So she was investigating both the phylogenetic history, the relationship, and the functional traits. And to do that, she selected different meadows in the same elevational belt. So we are here now all at 3,200 meters, where she selected 5 different sites. And this is again the meadow in full bloom now in July about, I guess. There are so many primroses. So you can see here again the lake reservoir. And she could include 12 different species into her analysis. And there, in these 5 meadows, 29 plant species that she could investigate. And she measured different traits for plants and the bumblebees. And investigated the interaction. So basically asking who is visiting whom and do they overlap. And so what you can see here on the right in the pink color then is the phylogenetic relationships of the bee species, and in green are the plant species. And these stripes in the middle, the connections are the patterns, how they are connected, like which bumblebee is visiting which plant species. And the size of the circles is correlated to how abundant these interactions are. So the bigger the circle is, the more often you find these interaction between this bumblebee species and this particular plant species. And what you found in this analysis is that the phylogenetic history of the bumblebees actually defines the visitation pattern to the plants. So the closer the bumblebee species are related, the more they also share the plant species that they visit. but vice versa, that's not true. So it's not like that the similar plant species that share phylogenetic history, so they are closely related, do not share the same bumblebee pollinator species. But how about the functional traits? So she measured different plant traits, from reward traits like pollen and nectar into flower morphological traits, the tube depths of so how deep the flower is, how accessible rewards for them are, into flower color, flower symmetry, and so on, and flowering time. And for the bee species, basically tongue length and also the peak abundance time, so the phenology of the bees. And what she found for the plant side, so we're now first looking at the phylogenetic signal of the traits in itself. So how conserved are they within a plant family or genus? And she found phylogenetic signals for pollen size, flower tube depth, inflorescence area, stamen location, nectar accessibility, and flower symmetry. So quite a lot of traits have a phylogenetic signal. So they are common and conserved in related plant species. And for the bumblebees also, tongue length and intertegular span, so the distance between the wings and the flight time has a phylogenetic signal. So, but what is important is the nectar volume and the sugar concentration, because they explain variation in the visitation patterns of bees to plants that cannot be explained by this phylogenetic signal. So they explain as an ecological factor bumblebee visitation patterns. And so in conclusion, we could see that there are different selection pressures, and both phylogeny and functional traits play a role. And for phylogenetic, the importance of phylogeny, we can see that related bumblebee species tend to visit similar plant species, but not vice versa. And for functional traits, it's mainly the reward of nectar that plays a role structuring these networks and identifying that different bumblebees spread their niches into different floral resources. And the trait that is important for bumblebees for finding and accessing floral resources, it's their tongue length. So it's the proboscis of a bee, and how defines how deep they can dig into a flower to extract nectar as a resource. And so we were asking whether tongue lengths can explain this ecological niche variation a little bit better, and also explain that closely related bumblebees that have similar proboscis lengths or tongue lengths can visit similar sets of species. And this is ongoing work that I'm still about to analyze with our PhD student Shuxing. Again, we include these 12 different bumblebee species with their different tongue lengths that we measured. And this time we put a lump together data from 4 years, so we have more plant species involved in these networks. But first of all, we grouped these bumblebees into different categories of tongue lengths. So we could identify that 2 belong to long-tongued bees. There are 6 belonging to medium tongue length bees, and 4 are short-tongued bees. And so there's significant differences in these clusters. So they are real groups of tongue lengths, as you can see. And then we constructed again the networks of which bee is visiting which plant. And then we clustered here. This is a cluster analysis of showing whether different bee species, depending on their tongue length category, as you can see in the different colors of red, blue, and orange, whether they would visit the same set of plant species. And you can see that they are not well clustered in this analysis. So we did a niche width analysis of bumblebees. And what is a niche width? So the niche width defines the ecological resources that is open or used by a certain species. So in our analysis, it's the number of different plant species that a bee is using. And so we were looking at or analyzing whether among these different tongue length groups of bumblebees, whether they have different niche width analysis. whether they have different niche widths. So the number of different plant species that they are utilizing for resources varies depending on their tongue lengths. And what you can see is that, yes, the short-tongued bees have on average, a larger niche width, so they utilize more different plant species than the long-tongued bees. And compared to the medium-tongued bees, although there's no difference between long-tongued bees and medium-tongued bees. And the second thing is when we analyze the same within functional groups, we can also see that within the short-tongued bees, there's actually a lot of difference. So these seem to spread out a little bit more, and some are more generalized and some are more specialized. As a general pattern, when we take tongue lengths as a continuous variable, we can show that the niche width decreases with increasing tongue length. So bees with longer tongues tend to have smaller niches, so they utilize fewer plant species and can thereby eventually avoid competition or specialize on certain sets of flowers, perhaps on long tube flowers with deep tubes where floral rewards are not accessible for shorter tongue bees, so they avoid competition. And the step where we are now is to look at the niche overlap. So we are identifying whether the different niches used by different bumblebees actually are overlapping or not. And what we, as a still preliminary result, we can see that there's no difference in the niche overlap between interfunctional groups and interfunctional groups. And so in conclusion for this part of our research, we can see that tongue length seems to negatively correlate to niche width. And so in long-tongued bees, they seem to have evolved specialized interactions with plants to avoid competition, whereas there's an adaptive generalization in short-tongued bees, so they can utilize and spread more on different plant species to gain rewards. What I'm now currently working on is the spatial and temporal variation of plant diversity, and particularly flowering resources along the elevation gradient, to see the same, if I can see what previous studies have shown within the elevational belt of 3,200 meters, whether I can see also that flowering resources can structure the elevational pattern of bumblebee occurrence. And in particular, I'm also investigating the most common bumblebee species, Bombus frisianus, to see whether their peak abundances follow the floral resource distribution along the elevational gradient. And so I'm using, again, the same meadows for my research, and also to get a little bit more fine-grained picture. Also another additional one in between at 3,400 meters, which is also heavily utilized by bumblebees. And instead of continuing with graphs, I thought I'm just showing you how actually the spatial temporal variation in flowering plants occurs on this mountain. So you can see in this little pictogram here at which elevation we are now with this plant, where they are flowering and occurring. And this is sort of a time axis, so you can see are there early spring or midsummer or autumn fall flowers. And so I was the first one who actually decided, well, I don't want to start my fieldwork in June, because I think we start right away when everything is already happening, but I want to know when it actually starts and where it starts. And I was quite surprised that compared to, or in contrast to many other mountain ranges where flowering season begins in the valley and then it climbs up, and there's a shorter, more pronounced peak season at the peak of the mountain. And then, so flowering season is usually longer at the bottom of a mountain. This is reversed on Yulong Mountain. So I climbed first up in February, and I found the whole, the peak actually is covered in blue of this Gentiana albumaginata. And this has really fascinated me a lot, because there's almost none of the flowers looking like the others. So it's extremely diverse and flowering extremely dense. So it's a really huge floral resource for the queen bumblebees. And so the queen bumblebees basically forage on the peak of the mountain in the early spring, because there are no floral resources at the bottom of the mountain. So it all starts at the peak, at the high elevation. But then it's also these massive Gentiana albumarginata is also co-occurring with some more rare gentian species, which are also really nice, Gentiana forestieri, Gentiana intricata. So they're all blue gentians co-occurring. So that's another fascinating thing. How can they share and compete? And then a little bit later into March, the rhododendrons start to flower, also first at the high elevation with Rhododendron fastigiatum. It's a shrub, very small rhododendron, but then also going a little bit lower at around 3,600, 3,400, 3,200 meters. You find this white flowering Rhododendron decorum and Rhododendron lepidotum. And this looks really beautiful when you climb up the mountain and then you come over and see this massive pink flowering, but still no flowers towards the low elevations. This only starts in maybe end of May, June with Primula prasonii, when then suddenly the whole wet meadows are covered in these really intense purple flowers. And they are also very interesting because they are really pollinated and visited by a huge diversity of insects, ranging from bumblebees and butterflies and other solitary bees. And the next one who is picking up the dominance in these wet meadows at medium-low elevation is Phlomis atropurpurea, which is, you can already see actually from this picture. So it's utilized by bumblebees, and then they have white pollen, and they really covered, the whole back is covered of the bees with this white Phlomis pollen. And then at the same time co-occurring this pedicularis cephalantera, which is also very specific because it needs this bus pollination. So no other pollinator can get out the pollen of this concealed tube where the pollen is hidden. So only the bees, by buzzing the flowers, can release the pollen from the anthers. And then in midsummer, maybe July, August, the low elevations get into really peak flowering, and it's basically yellow. So there are a lot of yellow asteraceae attracting mainly butterflies at this time, but also they make up a huge floral resource for bumblebees at mid-elevation, particularly these male bumblebees then also that visit these flowers. And then, different fabaceae, which can also only be utilized or visited by bumblebees or honeybees. And then again, it starts to decline at low elevation again, whereas the high elevations get a real huge peak in flowering of Polygonum macrophyllum. So this is fantastic. And there's so many bumblebees. Basically, when you catch them, you can just go like this. You don't really have to look anymore. You can just put it over a flower. There will be for sure a bumblebee. And so, yes, this is utilized by bumblebees as well as honeybees. It's really active. And then another floral resource that is used by bumblebees, actually occurring across the entire elevation range. So this was also interesting for me. This species occurs at low elevation at 2,000 meters as well as at 5,000 meters or so, and shows a really distinct morphological variation across the elevational gradient. So you can see on this picture, this is from low elevation. So the plants are typically much larger and have larger flowers. And this is now really towards the end of the flowering season to another sukuri, which makes almost like meadows. So it grows really dense in patches. And then also male bumblebees forage a lot on them. But again, you have still gentians that are co-occurring. And that's the last one of the season, which is almost exclusively visited then by male bumblebees and also restricted, as you can see, to really high elevation at 3,600 or 3,900 meters. And so this is again just a summary of the data that I'm currently analyzing, where you can see that bumblebees, so they are really abundant and comprise a large section of the, or portion of the flower visitors in these plant pollinator communities. And the season at low elevation is much, much shorter from April to September compared to at high elevation from February to October. And the other step, what I need for my analysis is then, of course, the floral resources. And so I had a PhD working on analysis of pollen production across the elevation gradient. So she collected and counted the pollen numbers in flowering buds, and then constructed, first of all, again, the phylogenetic history or the phylogenetic relationship. So whether closely related species produce similar amounts of pollen or not. And then analyzed also the elevational distribution. So if pollen production decreases or increases over an elevational gradient. And the general hypothesis or assumption in the literature is that pollen production would decrease as elevation increases because more plants would be selfing and not depend on pollinators. So they don't need as much pollen for reproduction. But as we also see many bumblebees at high elevation, we also don't see a decrease in pollen production. So I think this explains each other, so sort of. So now I'm combining these data of spatiotemporal variation in the distribution of pollen and nectar resources and flower visitation patterns by bumblebees. And then I showed a lot earlier that two of the most abundant bumblebee species, the Bombus frisianus and Bombus lepidus, are co-occurring over space and time. Despite they have some separation, but they still share a lot of their niches, their ecological niches. So I would like to investigate this a little bit further. Here's again the graph of the elevational distribution, where you can see they overlap. And here they somehow spread with one species occurring later in the season and one peaking earlier in the season, but they largely co-occur. And one factor that we think could also contribute to that is that at the mid-elevational belt, we actually have dry and wet meadows. And these dry and wet meadows have different sets of flowering communities, of course, depending on the ecological, the soil conditions. And so we are analyzing then whether one species more often occurring in wet meadows, Bombus frisianus and Bombus lepidus, more occurring in the dry meadows, whether they can actually avoid competition by specializing on wet and dry meadows in particular. And we have analyzed the functional traits again, the floral resources, and also the phenology patterns of these entire floral communities over the season. So to conclude from our research so far, what we know is that bumblebees are abundant and frequent visitors at high elevation in the Hengduan Mountains. And the bumblebees are species rich, and they can co-occur stably to some extent because of their separation into spatial and temporal niches, which structures their distribution. And we also found that phylogenetic relationship and functional traits play a role in structuring these bumblebee plant interaction networks. And tongue length seems to play a major role for defining the ecological niches and their overlap. And what we hypothesize and investigate in the future is then the spatiotemporal patterns of resource availability, which should also explain the distribution of foraging worker bees, and also the role of small-scale habitat variation and separation into different floral communities at similar elevation belts. And with this, I'm thanking you for the attention. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.